Hello there everyone, welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you the third and final part of our Peninsular War series we've been exploring as part of our French Wars series throughout this term. If you haven't already, do make sure you've checked out our previous two videos on this series. We went over the campaigns at Torres Vedras, the Battle of Salamanca, and the overall situation for the British and the French in this era. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So we should remember from our previous video, the British are finally having a string of victories. Wellesley's campaigns have gone extremely well for him, and he's pushed through Salamanca and secured some great victories. However, the key problem they faced was the supply line. It was still all the way back at Lisbon, and so they were unable to sustain the gains they made in 1812. And so by the time we get to the winter of that year, they had to eventually retreat and fall all the way back to Portugal, which was a real shame because they really had made some great progress. And for many, Wellesley was proving himself the finest commander of his generation. However, the tide was turning. The French had suffered a massive defeat all the way in Russia. Napoleon was an absolute disgrace. He'd lost around 600,000 men and so was unable to resupply the stretched French forces that were stationed in Spain. So as we enter 1813, the British now have a distinct advantage numerically and in terms of their supplies as well. So we're going to see in this stage now the Battle of Vitoria, how Wellesley goes on the offensive and finally manages to defeat the Spanish. And again, always keep in mind throughout this video series, again, what is causing the British victory? Is it Wellesley's leadership or is it another factor that's at play? Is it French blunders or is it successes with the Spanish and Portuguese or maybe other British officers at this time? So as always, a bit of background and build-up is essential to fully understand this. As we said, despite the victory they had in 1812, Wellesley was unable to turn it into an outright breakthrough, and so he had to spend the winter of 1812 resupplying his men. He also reconsolidates his relationship with other generals in his army. For instance, he coordinates well with Thomas Graham and Rowland Hill, who help prepare for the next offensive they intend to do in 1813. He also strengthens his alliance with the Spanish guerrillas. Again, remember, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance was strong, but it needed the mass support of the Spanish to have any chance against the French in pitched battles in the area. The Spanish guerrillas were also now rested and resupplied, and they were prepared to launch their own decisive offensive against Joseph Bonaparte's remaining French army in Spain. For the British, the 95th Rifle Division had all replenished their own Baker rifles, and the artillery battles had grown to their largest extent in the war. Some 100,000 men now comprised the entirety of the infantry, cavalry, and artillery that Wellesley had under his command. Wellesley personally describes his soldiers as the strongest he had ever seen. And this is commending his troops. They truly are an incredible force by now. They're well trained, well drilled, and well instructed. And again, this is the strength of Wellesley. He understands he does not have to work alone. The size of his army meant he can now delegate various columns to Graham and Hill, and therefore, because of the mass Spanish guerrillas they are now allied with, they now have their support in any offensive across the land, and also they have key intelligence. Again, you should remember from my infantry video, I mentioned skirmishers, how they go out and scout the land so they can give key intel back towards the commanders. The guerrillas are able to do that for the British. They know the terrain, they know the land really well, again, better than the French, and therefore they were to pass on that knowledge and expertise onto the British. Above it all, an agreement is reached where Wellesley is now deemed the complete commander of all the forces, so he could devise a strategy for the entire army and coordinate a full-scale offensive to achieve all his objectives, like what happened at Salamanca, where he can make some gains but not have it all fully linked up to break through this success later on. This simplicity in this coalition forces command structure, in allowing just this one man to make all the major decisions, sped up action. For instance, supply moved faster, intelligence sharing was more clear, and now they knew they could attack certain positions with a lot of clarity. There was no doubt, there was no need for indecision. They could just trust in this one man's decision and follow it to the letter and act accordingly. It also meant the Spanish were now lifting their caution on intelligence networking, and they were filling Wellesley in on the constant French positions and actions, which meant Wellesley could make informed decisions the entire time during the campaign. French knew they were on the back foot here, especially because Napoleon could not resupply them, given he'd lost so many soldiers in Russia. Joseph Bonaparte decided to flee away from Madrid and go towards Vitoria, intending to defend against the incoming Anglo-Portuguese attack. Marshal Jourdan oversaw the preparing the 57,000 men they had for the incoming offensive. And so we now get onto the campaign, the Battle of Vitoria. It's important, like before, we take stock of who exactly is at play here. We have Wellington, with Graham and Hill supporting him for the British and Portuguese offensive, and then we have Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Jourdan with the French who are preparing their defence. In the spring of 1813, Wellesley has now bid farewell to Portugal once more, and he confidently declared he would never have to return. With a 75,000 strong Anglo Portuguese army, they advanced all the way through to Madrid, all the way through northern Spain. Bonaparte, as we said, had fled and dug in at Vitoria, which was located on the west side of the Zazera River. Concurrently, Wellington's forces met up with Graham's, who had been in the northeastern sector until April 1813. Wellington was confident that his men's morale was high, and he felt this long push forward into Spain was a sign the breakthrough they were desiring was now truly possible. The Grand Armée was severely underpowered. Even Bonaparte himself had lost confidence in their ability to defend any attack incoming. Wellington was also now able to re-coordinate. He moved his supply convoy out of Lisbon for the first time in the war, replacing it with a port at Santander in the northern part of Spain. This also meant he was now abandoning the defences set up at Torres Vedras. Now, this was either going to be an arrogant blunder or a truly remarkable victory as he chased and caught up with Bonaparte's forces. But there's nothing to say Vittoria was without defence. Marshal Jourdan is here, and he, despite having suffered prior defeats, as nearly every commander had done during the Peninsular War, he now felt he had the advantage. Whereas the defeats had come a lot from attacking into defensive positions, the pressure was on Wellesley here. He was now having to attack a 60,000 strong French army in their own fortified positions. Plus, as well, he had the natural defence of the river, making it very tough to cross, and it meant he could slow down the British assault by using the terrain to his own advantage. Jourdan also had key artillery batteries, 155 guns. By contrast, Wellesley was bringing with him less than 100. And so, despite having more men than Jourdan's forces, Jourdan did arguably have superior firepower with his artilleries. However, Wellesley's trust was still within his infantry, and he believed they could smash through no matter how many guns the French had. So here's a general overview military map of the Battle of Vitoria. Like in our last battle video, I'm going to actually show you a simplified interpretation on my screen in just a minute. So I think it's very important we just be aware of a few symbols here. A few of you did message me after the last one and mentioned you found it a little bit complicated and wanted it to be a bit clearer. So I thought maybe it would help if I express what each of the symbols I'm going to show actually mean. Again, if you've watched my infantry, cavalry, and artillery videos, you'll already be aware of what some of these are, but there is a quick refresher on the screen for you to be familiar with before you move on to the next part of the video. Ready? Right, let's go to Vitoria. So, first off, we have Wellington's plan. His plan was very simple. He arrived in Maytime in 1813. He had this idea of a three-pronged attack on Jourdan's forces. The first was going to be a baiting attack in the south. The second would be the majority of his army he was going to personally lead to attack in the centre. And then the final part would be a third sweeping flanking operation in the north, cut off any sort of retreat, but also to entrap the French into the centre where they were much easier to contain and control. He assigned Graham to control the southern column and attack that sector of Jourdan's defences with Spanish support. He hoped the attack would trick Jourdan into reinforcing the lines for fear of flank falling. In truth, though, this is what he wanted. He wanted Jourdan to move forces away from the centre to severely weaken it. He knew roughly from Spanish intelligence about 40,000 of the army was situated just behind the river. So if they could smash through that, then they could truly break the back of those forces and win at Vitoria. The northern sector was left to General Hill. He was going to fight through and cut off any retreat Jourdan may try to do, or even any sort of retaliatory flanking attacks on the right. Ironic to his name, though, Hill's forces were actually slowed down in the hilly and high terrain in the mountains, and it took him several hours to navigate through the terrain, which meant they were behind schedule the night before the attack. Wellington had a key advantage. Despite Jourdan in some ways copying Wellington's idea of fortifying a defence and using natural terrain as a defence, he didn't adopt the strategy of scorched earth. So when Wellesley's forces entered the area opposite into Vitoria, they still had access to a lot of supplies and natural wells for water that it could have been robbed of. This allowed him to make sure his men were fully rested before launching the offensive. Furthermore, Spanish intelligence revealed that one of the bridges was still left undefended and completely exposed for easy crossing. Wellesley personally commented this was a huge blunder from Jourdan's French forces, and by allowing this bridge here, he therefore was able to cross it with ease during the battle and therefore not be bombarded by an artillery battery. We have to consider this. As impressive as what's about to happen is, perhaps Wellesley's victory came about because of Jourdan's initial operation failures rather than his own execution of success in the moment. And so, on June 21st, 1813, Wellesley's forces attacked. Graham launched the first wave as intended with British and Spanish forces. They crossed the river and quickly took several villages in the early morning. Jourdan took the bait on the left and he weakened his centre to reinforce the flank. This reinforcement worked and it meant Graham's men did stop at a standstill. However, in doing so, Hill's forces were able to link up and assist in the north and strike villages there. Ironically, it's probably worth noting that some Spanish guerrillas actually fought on both sides here. There was some assistance for the French in this northern sector, albeit most of them were for the British. Jourdan panicked and ordered his soldiers to retreat across the river, meaning both the northern and left flanks were faltering quickly. The bridge the Spanish guerrilla intelligence had detected was still left abandoned, so Wellesley's forces were able to take it quite quickly. Sensing French weakness, columns were ordered to cross the centre bridge and struck directly into the French defences. The attack was devastating, creating a clear breach in Jourdan's lines, leaving him little choice but to withdraw his troops, the troops he sent to fight Hill's flank attack on the left to reinforce his own exposed centre. Confidence now assured, Wellington ordered his centre column strike right behind the initial breach on the bridge. The French artillery batteries launched a massive barrage in a desperate effort to stop the advance, but the guns could not stop the Anglo-Portuguese skirmishers breaking through because they were too scattered for the artillery. Realizing his men were on the verge of defeat, Jourdan had no choice but to order a front-wide retreat, joining Joseph Bonaparte, who was fleeing on a wagon convoy heading eastward. He did try to use the cavalry to form a rear guard to cover their mass retreat, but it was so much smaller than Graham's forces by now that it did not work. Interestingly, Graham did not choose to press the attack. Instead, he chose to wait for Wellesley's forces to catch up and for the northern area to reconsolidate their position. This did admittedly anger Wellesley, who correctly understood that by Graham hesitating, they could not catch all 50,000 fleeing Frenchmen. Meaning, while a decisive success, Vitoria was not going to be the utter destruction of French forces as he had hoped for. With Jourdan retreating so quickly, they had abandoned some 150 of their artillery guns, meaning this was a massive blow to the firepower that the French force was capable of. This, in some ways, is the true material victory of Vitoria, the complete plundering of France's artillery force here. Meanwhile, Joseph Bonaparte did make it out of France and fled back to his own brother. But all the same, British had secured a striking victory, and the French were truly looking beaten in Spain. So let's bring it all together. Let's do a quick summary of what we've learned in this stage of the conflict. The three-pronged attack that Wellesley had devised was indeed a decisive victory. It destroyed Jourdan's defences, and Wellington was indeed victorious. For some historians, this is arguably Wellington's greatest success as a commander. This is better than Waterloo, than Salamanca, than even his defensive work at Torres Vedras. Again, that's for you to decide. Feel free to do so in the comments. The French suffered some staggering losses here. 8,000 of the 57,000 force was destroyed here. They lost over 150 guns. And in contrast, the Allied forces lost only about 5,000 soldiers. Wellington even acquired Jourdan's martial baton pictured on the screen in a painting, famously mailing it back to the British government as clear evidence of his resounding success. To get one of these batons was indeed a massive show of pride. Napoleon decreed his marshals the most successful commanders in all of the world. So for Wellington to have actually captured one like this was quite undermining for Napoleon, to say the least. It's also clear that Allied teamwork, Wellesley leadership, and even French blunders are what allowed this Anglo-Portuguese success in this battle. But from this battle, Spain's liberation soon followed, as French forces at Barcelona and elsewhere in Spain all retreated northwards. There would be a few more skirmishes, admittedly, up until the southern part of France, but French defeat wasn't cured because of Vitoria's stunning success. This indeed did prove far more decisive a victory than Salamanca had done, And indeed, this was the second biggest loss Napoleon suffered in less than a year. He'd lost massively during the Russian campaign at Moscow. He now lost here at Vitoria, and there was another battle to come in Leipzig, mainland Europe, where the three coalition forces of Prussia, Austria, and Russia secured a decisive success on him later in 1813. Perhaps it's fair to say Napoleon had stretched himself too thin on this two-front war, one here in the Peninsula and the other over in Eastern Europe. What is also true is that this was a resounding British victory, and from this Napoleon and France would finally be defeated in 1814. But that's not where our tale will end. There's still one more key battle to go, the Battle of Waterloo, and that is what we'll find out in our following video. Thank you as always for watching. I hope you found this video series useful in your studies. As always, do make sure you like, commenting and subscribing. Your engagement is always appreciated. What are you finding most fascinating so far in our series? Is it Wellington's success? Is it the French blunders? Or is it something else? Do make sure you let me know. I look forward to seeing you in our next video where we go into the Battle of Waterloo and discuss our final major campaign of this French war era. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.